Welcome to Best Practices in Transition Planning. I'm Sandy McDonald, and I'm a State Success Coach for Transition. Today we're going to move through this training at a pretty good pace. I will tell you that normally this training takes between 3 and 4 hours, depending on how much time you allot for the activities as they are built into this presentation. Now, before we begin, I want you guys to make sure that you have downloaded and have access to the handouts. And the handouts that we're going to be using are the Transition Planning Checklist, the Transition Feedback Form, the Transition Documentation Checklist, the Transition Plan Peer Review Process handout, and then some sample transition plans that we're going to use. We've got 4 of them. We're just going to call them Sample 1, 2, 3, and 4. In addition to those handouts, it's probably a good idea if you have access to your own transition plans, because toward the end of the training there will be time for you to take a look at those and do some work on those at your own pace. Okay, so the learning targets for this session are as follows. Number 1, I can identify at least 5 best practices in transition planning. I can name the 5 steps to writing the transition plan. I can determine whether or not a transition plan contains the critical elements as outlined in IDEA, and I'm able to suggest ways to improve upon previously written transition plans. So we will revisit those as we go and at the end as well. So during this session, I'm going to make a few assumptions about the folks in this training. First of all, I'm assuming you guys already have a basic understanding of transition planning and what it entails. I'm also going to assume that you would benefit from a review of how to write a compliant transition plan based on Indicator 13, and that you're looking for more ways to improve these transition plans and create transition plans that yield results way beyond Indicator 13. So I want to talk about the different ways of looking at transition planning. And this is important because many folks think, well, there's nothing wrong with our transition plans in our district. We already write them compliantly. We receive 100% every year. Why even look at going beyond Indicator 13? Well, first of all, if we take a look at the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, we can kind of understand why this is important. First of all, looking at the letter of law, that really is focusing on IDEA and what IDEA says that we should be doing. And in doing that, we're just identifying the minimal requirement for meeting the law, and as a result, it has a narrow impact on what happens to our students when they leave high school into adulthood. But if we look at the spirit of the law, which is, why was this law even written in the first place, we tend to gain more concept of why this was, what the intent of IDEA was, which leads to identifying possibilities for a quality adult life. This expands the focus of transition planning and services, and it will have a larger impact on our students as they leave us and go into adulthood. So once again, if we lean toward the spirit of the law or the intent of the law, we're looking beyond compliance, and we're looking past the actual words of requirement, and we're considering the intent behind the requirement. So let's talk about what best practices is. Many of you guys probably already know that best practices isn't necessarily research-driven or research-based, but it is a set of procedures that are accepted or prescribed as being correct or most effective. And so today I'm going to share with you a lot of best practices that we know make a difference. And I want you guys to be somewhat involved in this, and I want you to think about this. Spend a couple of minutes with the people at your table and ask yourselves, what are some things that you can think of that would make transition planning more meaningful for students and their families? So just take about 3 to 4 minutes to talk about that. Okay, so all of you guys have come up with some ideas, and hopefully you've written that on a flip chart paper or some kind of piece of paper, and we are going to share out at this point. So I want you to follow along with me. These are some best practices that we have come up with around the state of Georgia, and some of them were ideas that teachers presented to us, but these are things that we hear over and over again make a difference. And let's see, how many of you guys thought that starting transition planning early is a best practice? Oh yeah, good, awesome. And yes, this is true. It's best to start early. Now we know that IDEA mandates that transition planning should start at age 16 or younger when appropriate. Here in the state of Georgia, we've all kind of decided, come to the consensus that we're going to start transition planning in the 8th grade before the student reaches high school. And that's a really great place to start. As a matter of fact, as we go through the training today, you will see more and more why that's important. But remember that transition planning can start earlier than that. I've even seen it happen as early as elementary school. I wouldn't say that that should be a common practice, but when it's appropriate, please do so. Another thing that's a best practice is making sure that the transition plan is part of the IEP, that it's not just an isolated plan that you work on separate from the IEP. It should be a part of the entire process. As a matter of fact, when you start writing transition plans, it's important that you focus on the transition plan early in the IEP meeting. The best practice is to talk about the student's present level of performance, and then you go straight into the transition plan, and then you go back and hopefully that transition plan will help drive the remainder of the IEP. A lot of states embed the transition plan into their IEP. Ours happens to be a separate form. But if you make it a practice to go and complete the form and talk about the transition plan and then go back to the rest of the IEP, that's going to make it very smooth and meaningful for the student. And of course, the law says already that the student must be invited to their IEP meeting. And if the student can't be present, then all efforts should be made to share the student's preferences and strengths. Now, a best practice, of course, is to make sure the students are as involved as possible. Try to get the student there, if at all possible. And I've even, in my past experience as a teacher, made sure that if the student wasn't there, we just reconvene the meeting because it's just that important. Now, a lot of times you might have a student that is very low functioning, like a student with a severe or profound disability. So just be sure that even a student with a lower significant disability should be in the room. And it's important because even if the student is not able to speak or be an active participant, everybody in the room is well aware that this is the student we're talking about, this is the person that we are having this meeting for. Also, if you have agency representatives at your meeting, then that agency rep can get to know the student if they are there during the meeting. So another thing, of course, parent engagement is always important, and I hear from districts all the time that it's more and more difficult to get parents to the IEP transition meeting and to get them more involved. So just do what you can. I'm not going to elaborate on this a lot because different districts have different issues and different things that they can do with their parents. But it's very, very important that the parent is at the table as early as possible. And I will tell you that as early as we can get parents to understand what self-determination is all about, what the transition plan is all about, what it means to collaborate with agency representatives, you're going to have more empowered parents that are going to be doing more and more on their own without you leading the way. It's also very important that you use a variety of assessments. Now, the law says that transition planning is based on assessments. Now, I know for a fact that a lot of districts, they have 1 or 2 assessments that they use, and that's about it. And they repeat the same assessments every year, no matter who the student is or what their disability might be. What's a best practice is to make sure that you have gone through a number of assessments and have identified an array of assessments that will match different types of students, different ages, different grades, different disability types, and also take a look at the student's particular needs at the time. If there's a student who maybe they've identified their career choice, but you're not really sure what their self-determination skills are like, maybe look at some self-determination types of assessments to fill that gap. So it's very important that you have an array. Another best practice is to monitor the progress of your goals regularly, just like you do any other parts of the IEP. Those goals typically are reviewed every progress report period. So it stands to reason that your goals that you list on your transition plan are reviewed just as frequently. And when you do that, make sure that you not only review them, but you do make a statement in the outcomes column indicating whether the goal's been met, at what point you are at in meeting that goal, and so on and so forth. And of course, don't forget the partners that you can include in the transition planning process. Some of the partners may be Georgia Vocational Rehabilitation counselors. General ed teachers, of course, should always be at your meetings anyway, your other agency reps, etc. And think outside the box. If you've got a student who's working, for instance, it's not unusual for an employer to come to that transition plan meeting. If you've got a student that's going to be going to college soon and has identified that college, it's not inappropriate for that college rep to be there, or the disability services director from that college. So always think about who can we get to the table that's going to help drive this transition plan, help develop this transition plan. And then one thing that really isn't stressed a lot in IDEA is talking about the age of majority. But it is part of the transition plan that you talk about what happens when the student nears the age of 18, and then you address it again once the student is 18, and you talk about what that means. Make sure that you are well-versed and your teachers are well-versed on what age of majority means and how to guide the parents toward finding out more information. Now, as you can see on this slide, it says age of majority is the age when children become legal adults and have the right to make informed decisions. And so this can lead to a nice, rich discussion at your transition plan meeting. And I will also share with you that if you are looking for places to send the parents to get more information on guardianship, there are a couple of places that they might look. First of all, go to the Georgia Probate website, and there are documents there that you can download and print and share with parents. Also, the Georgia Council of Developmental Disabilities has a very good handout as well that you can print and have ready for parents. And remember, when parents start talking about guardianship options, that's not your job to talk to them about that sort of thing. Just lead them to the right people where they can get more information and know where to go next. Another thing you should always talk about and think about is sharing resources with the parents. Now, sometimes this is a problem if the teachers themselves don't know what resources are out there. So that's something that you guys can work on within your district. Teaching your teachers what is out there in your community, what resources are available for students with disabilities while they're in school, but also what adult services are available once they leave school. Because parents are going to need a lot of direction on who to talk to and where to go and what's going to be a good option for their child as they look toward the future. So here are some things to consider. Post-secondary education and training options like colleges, other training options, adult services, and then if you've got a student that wants to go straight into employment, hooking them up with vocational rehabilitation is a must, actually, for either one of these. And then there are also agencies out there that offer job coaching, actually job finding. They can seek jobs out for your student with a disability. Also, parents would need to know independent living options that might be available. And then, of course, there's a huge array of other agencies out there. So, I guess in conclusion of this part of the presentation is that make sure that when you write transition plans, that they are meaningful and unique for each student. Now, you notice I have a picture here of a puzzle cookie cutter. And the reasoning for that is because I want you to stay away from cookie cutter transition plans. And that is something that we see all the time. You might develop a transition plan that is beautiful, and everybody agrees this is a great transition plan for this student. And so that might tell you, oh, okay, so it's a great transition plan. I'm going to use that for this next student. And sometimes it's good to have a guide like that you can work from, but I just want to caution you heavily, don't do that as a practice. Don't use the same transition plan for multiple students. Always make sure that you're considering who that student is, where they're going, and what their needs are. We do not want to see the same plans for all your students. So there are a lot of different tools and resources out there beyond this training session and beyond these handouts that I've given you. The first 4 things on this bulleted list are websites that you can go to. And NTAT stands for National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. And I will tell you that this website contains a wide array of resources and information, including toolkits on a variety of transition-related topics. The next one, the Transition Coalition website, is one that many of you guys could be familiar with already. This is based out of the University of Kansas. And these folks at the National Coalition are the ones that developed that wonderful tool that we use across the state called the Quality Indicators of Transition Practices. We lovingly call it the QI. And many of the districts in Georgia have gone through and utilized the QI to kind of give their district a grade on how they're doing with transition planning. And from that, they also have different training tools. They have different modules that they've created on different facets of transition, as well as some Georgia study guides that direct you to resources here in the state of Georgia. So the Transition Coalition is great. In addition to those things, they have an extensive list of transition assessments. So we were talking earlier about the assessment toolbox that you can create. This is a great place to go, the Transition Coalition. Take a look at a lot of different assessments. It tells you information about the assessments, where to go to find them, how much they cost, and you will find that most of them are either free or real cheap, so that's good news. The third one, a transition guide to post-secondary education and employment for students and youth with disabilities. That's something that was recently developed by the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, oftentimes known as OSERS. You're probably familiar with that. And it's for youth, families, and professionals who work with transition planning. It also involved vocational rehabilitation, and it's very good. It's a great, just general transition manual that you could use for sharing with your teachers as well as your families and students. This next one, Transition to Life Beyond High School Resource Guide, is something that was developed here in the state of Georgia. And in Middle Georgia, it's just a list of resources here in Georgia that you guys may want to take a look at. It reaches beyond just Middle Georgia, though, and so it may be very helpful for some of you. These last 4 bullets that are not hyperlinked are the actual handouts that you have, and we're going to be going over these in just a few minutes. Transition planning checklist, the feedback form, the documentation checklist. And then, of course, I said each other because as you guys go through this training together and beyond, you're going to find that even before you go to any of these resources, it might be better just to go to somebody down the hall or somebody who has really done a lot of transition plan writing in the past. And so, to me, it's a really good idea to identify the folks in your building who are good resources that you could go to and say, hey, take a look at my transition plan and tell me what I might need to be doing differently or better as you prepare for those. So let's take a close look at this tool. Hopefully everybody's got it. It's called the Transition Planning Checklist. As you can see there at the bottom, you may not be able to see this well on the screen, but this was developed by Dr. Jaquel Johnson in Houston County a few years back, and she gave us permission to use this form statewide. And so it has been adapted to make it more general and more useful for you. Again, you can't really see it very well on the screen, but if you take a look at yours, you'll see that it's kind of listed by section, different section of the transition plan. On the left here, it shows the checklist items. And when we talk about the checklist, we're talking about what we're checking off when we talk about compliance. And here's a way that you can look at a plan and check yes or no, was it done? This is a nice column because it tells you whether or not it's required by IDEA. And in the far right, it gives comments, which kind of gives you some instruction on how to make sure that these items are present and how to make sure that these items are compliant. So that's just a snapshot of the front page of the Transition Planning Checklist. You can see that it's more than just one page in your handout. Okay, here's another tool we're going to be using a little bit later today. It's called the Transition Plan Feedback Form, and this is actually a form that I developed many years ago when I worked in a school district. And the purpose of this form is to make sure that somebody else's transition plan is in good shape. You may have somebody in your district that routinely checks all the transition plans that are written, and this would be for that person, or somebody in your building that might check somebody else's transition plan. We're going to be talking a lot a little bit later on about peer review process. So this is something that you would utilize during that peer review process. And don't be afraid, these are skinny looking lines, but this is actually on a Word document in which you will receive this electronically. Don't worry about these because this is written on a Word document. As you type into these lines, they expand. And so this is just a way for you to give a little feedback to teachers to kind of lead them back onto the right track if they're not writing transition plans the way they need to be. One thing that I like about this too is up here I've got a green, yellow, and red line, and if it is a great transition plan and it needs no doctoring, you can put a check mark in the green area. If it only needs minor changes or improvements, you can put a check mark here, or if the plan really needs a lot of work, then you can indicate that, and that might be the time when you sit down with the teacher and really talk to them about how things should be done. Could be that the teacher has never had transition training before and they're just a little lost. So that's a really neat form. This form it's got a long name, Transition Documentation Checklist, but we refer to it oftentimes as just the rubric. This is what we use at the state level when we're checking your transition plans that are sent to us each year when we monitor for Indicator 13. A lot of times district directors like to use this form because it gives you a good idea as to whether or not your transition plans are going to meet compliance. Now the difference between this one and the two previous forms, this one is just showing you if you're going to meet compliance. The two previous ones give you opportunities to give feedback and really look at putting in some best practices whenever you're doing your transition planning. I'm not going to go a lot into detail on this. You guys have it in front of you, so we are going to walk through this in just a few moments to make sure that everybody understands this. Okay, so this is where we're going to start talking about the reviewing what compliance is all about, all right? And what I've done here is I have kind of broken down the transition plan into 5 general steps. And I feel like if we can get a handle and get in our mind what these 5 steps are, it's going to be a lot easier and it's going to mean more to you as you lead your team into writing a transition plan. And we'll just talk about these steps first, and then we're going to expound upon each one. The first step is talking about where is a student now, looking at the present moment, getting a snapshot of who the student is and where the student is right now. And that is usually located in the preferences section of the transition plan. The second step is taking a look at where is a student going. And remember, one of the components of IDEA says that transition planning is a results-oriented process. So we flash ahead, we look at where the student is planning to go, where they want to go as an adult, and then we kind of work backwards. And we figure out, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that that student is able to get there at some point in time as an adult. The third step is actually asking what needs to happen this next year to get that student that much closer to their post-secondary goal. And this is found in the annual transition goals section. And accompanying those goals are the activities and services, which is what is needed to help the student reach this annual goal. And you can think about activities and services as being like baby steps to reaching the annual goals. And then, of course, not necessarily last, but the last part that we're going to talk about today is the IEP team documentation, because IDEA says that you have to invite the student You've got to invite the parent and agency reps as appropriate. Okay, so that's very important that you've thought about whether or not the key people have been invited to the meeting. So let's start with step one, which is where's the student now? And I want you to think about this preferences section as sort of present levels of performance for transition. And I always tell people that this is an important section because it kind of gives, like I said, a good snapshot, a good picture of where the student is now. And this is particularly important if you've got people in the meeting who really don't know the student that well. You may have brought in an assisted principal, maybe the counselor, maybe the voc rehab counselor has not met this student before. But if you've got a well-written preferences section, it gives that person a good indication of who the student is. Now, here is a listing of the things that can be talked about in the preferences section. The first two are required by law, so you've got to make sure you've got those two things. The course of study, which includes the diploma type or the career pathway, and assessment information, which would include the name and results. If you take a look at that transition planning checklist that I gave you guys, you'll see over in the comments section that it goes into, it does describe what you need to have for each of these things. And then these things are optional, but I always try to include this, again, so that a well-rounded picture of the student is portrayed. A brief description of the student, maybe the student's grade, age. You might even include their disability type. What their preferences are. And when I talk about preferences, I'm not just talking about work preferences. I'm talking about leisure activities, what they like to do, those kinds of things. Strengths, and we're talking about relative strengths, and all students have strengths, so be sure that you include what that particular student's strengths are. Their interests, and anything else that will help somebody know where the student is. This could be things like jobs, if somebody's doing volunteer work or doing some kind of paid activity. That'd be great. If they are already working with a voc rehab counselor, you can talk about that and where they are in the process. Whether the student's driving or not, that's a huge thing to consider. Whether or not the student is attending their IEP meetings and leading the meeting. Just anything that the student might be doing, or even the parents, really, if they're doing some work on behalf of the student. So, remember, assessment was one of those first two bullets. So let's talk about assessment. We could do a whole day's training on assessment, so I'm going to try to sum it up kind of nicely for you today. Why is it important? Well, this is kind of common sense, but I'm going to outline it anyway. It helps identify the student's interests and preferences for future employment opportunities. It also identifies their strengths and weaknesses, their skills, abilities. It helps students making realistic, informed decisions, and that's huge. You're going to probably hear me talk about that a little bit more. And it helps you in developing a good, meaningful transition plan. Okay, so I can't say enough about assessments. As a matter of fact, we're going to go even deeper into it. So when we talk about assessments, there are different types of assessments we can look at. We can look at standardized test, previous information, formal assessments, and informal transition assessments. These first two, you probably already have, but they should not stand alone. Okay? Just because you have these assessments doesn't mean it's going to satisfy what we're needing for writing the transition plan. The reason I put it on this slide is because these types of assessments can help share some information that will lead to a good goal, or maybe taking a look at what might be a good goal for a student, either post-secondary or an annual goal. Previous information are things like psych reports, IEPs from the past, school transcripts, disciplinary records. This is extremely helpful if you've gotten a student from another district or another school within your district that you don't really know that well yet. And this is something that I often do when I go into transition plan meetings and I don't know the student well. I'll ask for these kinds of documents. This information is very helpful so that I get a kind of a true picture of who the student is. These last two columns are the ones I really want you to focus on. Again, these are things that you might consider putting into your arsenal of transition assessments. And when we talk about formal assessments, those are typically those commercially developed assessments. They're oftentimes based on norms, but they can assess student interest, aptitudes, their personality types, work preferences, etc. I mentioned self-determination a little earlier, independent living skills, you know, the list goes on and on. These can be either pencil and paper, they can be online, they can be hands-on assessments. There are all kinds out there. Again, if you need more information on assessments, these formal assessments, you feel free to contact me or anyone else you know from the State Department level. They can direct you to the right place. Again, that Transition Coalition website can be helpful here as well. When we talk about informal assessments, these are things that you guys can do that don't cost a thing. And sometimes these give you the best results also anyway. Transition questionnaires, you can develop these yourself. You can talk to other districts to find out what they might use, but questionnaires are a really good way to get to know the student. These are good because sometimes they can be administered to a whole group, but I think oftentimes they're even better if it's a one-on-one sort of questionnaire, if it's just something that kind of helps lead a discussion about transition. Also, you can develop transition questionnaires or use some that are pre-developed for parents, because it's always a great idea to find out what the parents are thinking in line for their child. Checklists that you might use are also good informal assessments. And for instance, if you take your students out into the community on CBI trips or community-based vocational training sites, these checklists can be very, very telling of if a student is job ready, what they can and cannot do out in the community, what they might need to work on. Anecdotal records and teacher and parent observations. The most important thing to remember is when you talk about or use these informal assessments that you describe in your preferences section the type of assessment that was used, what the name of it was, and then the results. Don't just say, well, I met Carol in the hallway and she told me she wanted to go to college next year. That's not an assessment. But you could say, according to an interview with Carol, Carol said that she would like to go to a 4-year university and major in early childhood education. And that could be an assessment or part of your assessment information. Okay, so these are the things to look for, in your assessments, and you're going to hear me repeat these things because it's so very important. Doesn't hurt to hear it more than once. It's also on your transition planning checklist. It's also on the documentation checklist, or the rubric. You must include the name or the description of the assessment used. You have to have evidence that some kind of an assessment was used. It's okay to say according to an interview with a student, but it's not okay to say just the student said that. All right, I hope you understand. You must include the results, and it's usually found in the preferences section, but sometimes we find it in other parts of the IEP. Now, I will tell you, the best practice is to go ahead and write this out in the preferences section. So if somebody is looking for that information, it's not like an Easter egg hunt that they are able to find it pretty easily. Now, on Go IEP, many of you guys are using Go IEP now. It does force you, there's a little column or a little space for you to write in the name of the assessment, but there is not a space to write the results of that assessment. So that's something that until it is changed, you need to make sure that you are still writing the assessment results in the preferences section. Okay, you might just have to repeat yourself a little bit there. Okay, so these are things that I've probably talked about already, but just to review, there are many free assessment tools. You can use teacher interviews, but I would also look at some others as well to have in your arsenal. Use the following phrase, based on these assessment results, ... And that way you're certain that you are including the name of the assessment and the results. And here's something, too, that maybe you haven't thought about, but assessments have to be noted on the individual graduation plan from the time the student is in the 8th grade. And so it's okay to use some of those same assessments. That information can be very helpful on transition plan. And this I already talked about. If you're using Go IEP, that make sure you include that information as far as the results go. All right, so here are some tips, okay? In my many years of doing this is just something that's very helpful. Make sure you do your assessments well in advance. Don't wait until the day before the transition plan meeting. You want time to assess the student, make sure the outcome is good, because sometimes you might give an assessment for a student and it doesn't give a good result. For instance, there are many interest tests out there. If a student goes through an interest test, they might say, oh, this sounds fun, oh, this sounds fun, oh, this sounds fun, and then it comes up with a list of 1,000 different jobs. It hasn't narrowed it down at all. That happens quite often. Sometimes a student doesn't quite understand exactly what this is getting at. So if you get an assessment result like that, it tells you, okay, I need to use something different, or I need to go further with this student. So doing them well in advance will give you time for that. It also gives you time to look at the results and share the results with the student, and maybe even share the results with a parent before the meeting takes place. And that kind of leads to the second one. Discuss the results with the student. Make sure the student understands the purpose of the testing. I know sometimes students don't like to be tested. They're tested to death already. But if you help them understand, well, this test is different. This test we're going to use to write your transition plan so that we can look at what you might do after you leave high school. And that might be pretty exciting for them and something that would spur them on. Again, if you don't get good results, just do some more assessing. Oftentimes I'll hear teachers say, well, my student, what about those middle school students that always come up with these very lofty goals, like they want to be a movie star or a veterinarian or a pro football player, and they're not even playing football in school. So this might tell you, well, we just need to do some more assessing with this student. They have not gotten to the point where they are looking at themselves in a realistic fashion. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So now I want you to pair up, just your elbow partner, just talk about this for a couple of minutes. What are some issues that you encounter related to transition assessments? Because I hear these all the time. I want you guys to talk about it and let me know what you think. Okay, so what are some things that you guys came up with? Let's share out. Okay, time constraints, and that's a big one. A lot of times teachers, they say, we have no time to do these assessments, and it is an issue. I understand that. And I'm not saying that you should pull the student out of class, to do these assessments. It's great if maybe you could be creative and maybe have lunch with the student one day, and maybe you can have an informal interview with the student over lunch, or find some time before or after school to work with this student. Sometimes schools have built-in time for advisement. So if you have a built-in time where maybe you can work with a student during that time, that's something that you can do. There's no easy answer for time constraints. I know it's a huge issue, though. What's something else? Okay, that's a good one. Apathetic students. So the student that maybe doesn't seem to really even care about this process. I don't want to be tested. This is stupid. Why are we doing this? And again, if you work early enough with a student, again, 8th grade or earlier, start talking about their future, getting them excited about what's coming up. Let them know that this is just part of the process. We've got to have this information before we can move forward. That again is an issue that I hear often. Anything else? Okay, so yes, administering tests can sometimes be lengthy, and a lot of times your students don't have the patience or the focus to sit through a lengthy test. Break it up. There's nothing that says you have to do it all in one sitting. You can do one section one day, one section the next, however you want to do it. You can be the person that fills in the bubbles. Just do whatever it takes. You can do some accommodating for the student in doing this kind of testing as well. Okay, so let's move on. Those are very good. And hopefully these that we've talked about today and some of the ones that we didn't get to talk about we'll touch on during the rest of the training. Now, this is something that maybe you guys talked about too. What about those students with most significant disabilities? Those students with severe and profound disabilities are the ones I'm talking about. This is an issue. You can't necessarily use the same assessments with those students that you do with your SLD students, your speech speech and language students. So we've got to think outside the box. And I will tell you, these next few slides I borrowed from Casey Harshaw in a presentation that she did a couple of years ago at an IDEAS conference. And so these are things that, that I've heard really do work. So let's talk about this. First of all, these assessments where students with most severe disabilities may be nonverbal. And they can be based on information from teachers and family members, you know, things that are observed by the family members and the teachers. So hopefully you can read this. I will read some of this to you. Some things, a lot of times when you're talking about those low incidence students, we're really needing to know, how do they communicate with us, okay? And that's going to be huge. That's going to be possibly one of their post-secondary goals even, is how is a student going to communicate with us and helping to make sure their needs are met, both in high school and beyond. And just take a look at these kinds of things. Do they respond to interaction? Do they respond to communication? Do they initiate communication? Do they make choices? Can they eye gaze? Can they answer yes and no questions? Do they follow directions? Can they label objects and pictures? Can they utilize AAC devices? Can they activate a switch? And that is huge because, as you know, activating switches can open a lot of doors for students with no verbal skills. Can they respond consistently? And other skills you might look at are these: understanding cause and effect, grasping and releasing, carrying and holding, identifying names, symbols, and words, identifying what comes next, matching to samples, differentiating between same and different, sorting by color, shape, and size, using one-to-one correspondence, counting, sorting, and packaging, counting and using a jig, and measuring, pouring, and stirring. And those, you know, that's just a short list. You guys probably have many, many more that you can think of to add to this. So let's take a closer look. And here we have symbols for the student to be able to choose and place up in the boxes. And so for a student who's nonverbal, they may be able to do something like this. Look at some pictures and place them in a way that you can tell what they like. This particular student enjoys shopping, going to a restaurant, playing or listening to music, and taking walks, okay, in this case in a wheelchair. And you can also do something that's more of a hands-on activity where you've got a tray and you've got actual objects that the student can place in the tray. And you can see this particular student put a purse and a Frankenstein movie in the tray. So that kind of helps identify what they are interested in, what they like to do. There's a lot more on that topic. Again, if you need more information on how to work with students with the most significant disabilities, please contact me or somebody at the State Department level. Let's now talk about the other item that's required in that step one. Remember, we talked about assessments, and now let's take a look at the course of study. And I said earlier that course of study is just talking about their diploma type and or their career pathway. Now, to me, in order to make it a really best practice, I would do both. I would talk about their diploma type and their career pathway. And these are the career pathways, and hopefully you guys have seen these before. They're not new to you, and they are offered in your school district. Now, I do know that if you're in a rural school district, you may not have access to all of these career pathways. And so my advice to you is just do the best you can. Try to match the career pathway with your student as well as you can. And when we look at transition plans, we oftentimes will see that perhaps a student is aiming for a particular job after high school, but it doesn't quite align with their career pathway. And that's not something that we are going to second guess. We're assuming that there was a reason for that, and possibly the reason is because it's not offered in your school district. So please take a strong look at career pathways and try to drive the student toward that if it's in line with his post-secondary goals. So for the rest of this training, we're going to take a look at an example, a sample student, and we're going to talk a little bit about Robert. And let's go ahead. I've kind of written a case study, and hopefully you guys can see this. And I'm going to read this out loud because it's kind of hard to see. Robert is a 14-year-old 8th grade student who has received services through the Learning Disabilities Program since the 3rd grade. He is generally cooperative, has good attendance, and works hard to succeed in all his classes. Reading and spelling are major areas of difficulty for Robert. While cooperative with peers and adults, Robert has limited social interaction with students outside of his special education classes. He rarely attends school-related activities outside of school hours and does not belong to any school clubs or sports teams. Robert would like to obtain a part-time job in the afternoons. He enjoys working in hands-on situations and, due to his high level of interest, has extensive knowledge in auto engine repair. Robert's school district offers classes in auto and body repair through their CTAE program. Despite Robert's learning difficulties, his parents have expectations of him succeeding in higher education. He wants to please his parents, but questions his ability to be successful in a college setting. Per Robert, this has been a source of frustration for him and his parents. The transition specialist recently completed some assessment instruments with Robert utilizing the GCIC, which is the Georgia Career Information Center website. According to the results of the Occupation Sort Classic and the ONET, some careers Robert might consider include automotive repair technician, automobile mechanic, automobile glass installer, and machine operator. Okay, so that's Robert. And you may know students similar to Robert. He's a good one to kind of use as an example. And I want you guys to think about this. If you're looking at a transition plan that was written for Robert, this could be his preferences section. I want you guys to look at this as a group and decide, first of all, whether or not it meets compliance, and then if you think it is lacking anything, if there's something else that could be talked about in this section. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes for that activity. All right, so what did you see here? First of all, is the assessment information there? Yes, it is. Here they've talked about the GCIS and the ONET, and the results were automotive repair technician, etc. So that part is there. Okay, the other required part of this section for step 1 is to talk about his career pathway, or his course of study, actually. And yes, they did talk about his type of diploma, didn't they? All right, is there anything else that could have been discussed here based on the little case study that we just read previous to this? Okay, you guys may have come up with the fact that, no, they didn't talk about his career pathway, did they? They talked about his diploma, but it would have been helpful if perhaps they talked about his career pathway to make sure that there was a match. And this is going to be very helpful as we write the transition plan and making sure that he takes those necessary steps to complete that pathway. Anything else? Well, remember, whenever we looked at the case study, well, let's just take a quick look at it again. It talked about his hands-on situations. He has extensive knowledge in engine repair. That might have been a good thing to talk about. You could have talked a little bit about, the things that his parents are seeing as frustration. Those are some things that you could have added. But in general, this is going to meet the law, and it does say a couple of things about Robert beyond that. Okay, so this is going to be just fine unless you wanted to add some of those other things that were in that case study. All right, so hopefully you guys understand step 1, which is where's the student now? And remember, it can be summed up in that preferences section, talking about the assessments and the course of study. Now step 2 goes to the next step, which is where is the student going? And when we talk about this, we're going to focus on 3 different topics under post-secondary goals. We're going to talk about the student's education and training post-secondary goal, their employment post-secondary goal, and their independent living post-secondary goal. And I want you to stop and with your elbow partner, talk about this question. What are some issues that you encounter when writing post-secondary goals? Okay, so now let's talk about what you came up with. All right, one thing that I heard is that students oftentimes have unrealistic post-secondary goals, which I alluded to a little bit earlier. And that is true. A lot of times you will find a student who is really wanting to do something as an adult that is just way, way far-fetched. Now, I am not one to say whether a goal is going to be unrealistic for a student or not. That is something that I really don't even like to say, because who are we to say that the student can't do something? But if there's something that's more suitable for that student, I think it is our job to point that out to the student and help them see that. Oftentimes, again, this just means that more assessment is needed. What else? Okay, so this is something I hear oftentimes. A lot of times teachers are nervous about writing these post-secondary goals for a student because they say, okay, what if the student leaves high school and he's not successful in meeting this post-secondary goal? Can they come back and sue the school district or us? And the answer is no, they cannot, because this is not our goal that we're making up for the student. It is the student's goal that you have just written down on this document for him. And so just keep in mind, this is not your goal that you've come up with. This is something that the team has come up with, and the student was included in this. So remember, there were three categories. There was employment, education and training, and independent living. And so let's start with employment. So every student has to come up with a post-secondary employment goal. And when we talk about post-secondary employment, we're not talking about that little part-time job that they are involved in while they're going to college. We're talking about their eventual employment goal after college or after whatever training they go through. Okay, that eventual employment goal. And so there's a couple of do's and don'ts I want to point out. First of all, it is a good idea to always begin with after graduation. And I say that because sometimes teachers don't quite understand post-secondary, meaning after high school, and they will say something that's going to happen during high school. And so this will just force the teacher to be, and the whole committee really, on thinking after high school. And then make sure that you're only talking about one job or career or field. Now, if you take a look at your transition planning checklist, you'll see over in the right-hand column it gives you some guidelines for that. And there are some exceptions for this. Sometimes a student may be interested in something computer-related, but they're not sure if they want to do something that is related to IT or writing software. And so you could put both of those since they're closely related. And the reason for that is because the pathway to get there is going to be the same. And of course, once they get into the training for that, then they're going to focus on one or the other. And so you can list both of those. But if they're way different, don't list both. Make sure that you are looking toward the one that the student wants to do the most or one that's going to be most doable for that student. And let the student know, especially a younger student, 8th or 9th grade, that this could change slightly as they get older. But once the student is older, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, you do want the student to be able to lock in onto a good, solid post-secondary employment goal so that they can be working toward that. Another exception that's on that checklist is the military. You know, if a student wants to go into the military, you don't necessarily have to say what they're going to focus on in the military. You can just say they are going to get a job through the military and leave it open-ended that way. And then, of course, stay away from this. Don't create a goal that will take place during high school, and don't refer to that temporary job. Now, when we talk about the post-secondary goal for Robert for employment, take a look at this one. After graduation, Robert wants to work as a mechanic. Okay, what do you think about that goal? Is that well stated? Okay, this would meet compliance. All right, this would meet compliance. I want you to, some people say, well, yeah, but I don't like that word wants to. Well, that's okay. I guess a better way to phrase it would be will work as a mechanic, okay? I would encourage you to use the word will as often as you can, but as long as we know what Robert is working toward, that's what we need to focus on. If we say Robert wants to, that's going to be just fine. All right, very good. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the post-secondary goal for education and training. And this is similar to the employment goal. The same kind of guidelines fit. If you look at your transition planning checklist, again, start with after graduation. But here you're going to put the type of training as well as the area of the training or the major. Again, make sure you're only addressing one area, or if they're very similar, you can address two areas, but make sure they're very similar. Again, the military is an exception. You can say they will receive training through the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, whatever, branch. You don't even have to put the branch. But don't create a goal that will take place during high school. That's always something to stay away from. So let's look at the transition post-secondary goal for Robert for education and training. After graduation, Robert will attend a technical college of some sort. What do you think about that? Well, some people get hung up on this part of some sort. That part's okay. I don't have a problem with that. If you do know the type of college, yes, you can be specific. I've even seen people write the exact college that the student wanted to go to, and that's okay too. But what's missing from here is the area or the major that Robert is pursuing in this college, the technical college. So for Robert, since he wants to do automotive repair of some sort, then you could say, well, attend a technical college in the area of automotives or automotive repair. And then that would be compliant with IDEA. Okay, so now let's move on to the post-secondary independent living goal. Now, I will tell you, again, if you're looking at the transition planning checklist, you'll see this. This is not necessarily required. The first two categories are the employment, the education and training, and employment goals. But this one is not. This is something that you as a team decide if this student needs to have a post-secondary goal written. And the way you do that is if this particular student could live independently without any further instruction in school or any other kinds of supports or activities and services, then don't write a goal here. He's going to be okay. But if this is a student that you're not really sure if he's going to be able to live independently without some further instruction or some kinds of activities and services in place to make sure that that happens, then it is appropriate. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Again, the same things are said with this. Begin with after graduation. Don't create a goal that's going to take place during high school. And this is something new. Don't refer this to the student's temporary living situation. Like Robert will live with his parents while he's attending school. All right, we're not talking about that kind of goal. We're talking about eventual living goal. All right, so be thinking about that. So here's one. This team obviously decided that a goal needed to be written for Robert, and so they came up with, after graduation, Robert will live with his parents while he attends college. Now, didn't I just say that you shouldn't do this? That's right. So if we had to change this, we could either leave it out entirely. Okay, maybe Robert doesn't need further instructions or activities and services to be able to live independently, or we say something like, after graduation, Robert will live independently from his parents, or Robert will continue to live with his parents, or in an apartment with a roommate, whatever the situation might be. And you guys, again, decide that by talking to Robert, talking to his parents, and coming up with a kind of a consensus. Okay, so we've already done steps 1 and 2. Let's talk about step 3. Step 3 is when we kind of back up, reel it in a little bit, and we say, what can we do this next year, from this day to the same day next year, to make sure that Robert is advancing and progressing toward his post-secondary goal. Now, this gets a little confusing because the law says, or what we've been told over and over again, is that the annual goals must be in alignment with a post-secondary goal. Well, when I say in alignment, that doesn't mean it has to be real specific to that post-secondary goal. Let me give you an example. Since Robert is going to work as a mechanic after graduation, his annual goals don't all have to do with that automotive class that he's taking. We just need to make sure that we are doing some things with him in the high school level so that when he gets to that point, he is ready for work he has the supports that he needs when he leaves high school. And I will be giving you some examples as we go, all right? Okay, so here is an example. I mean, here is some things that you need to know when we take a look at step 3. You must have at least one annual goal under the categories of employment and education and training. Those are required, okay? However, on a transition plan, you have all of these other categories that you can create goals for. And I want you to remember that it's not a good idea to take shortcuts and just consider these first 2 categories. Always consider these for all of your students. You know, it may be that you don't have to look at all of these other ones, but always consider them. Now, we've already talked about these, but I'm going to elaborate a little bit more. For education and training, these annual goals can be related to getting the student into the desired post-secondary education and training institution or situation. However, it can also be, how are we going to get the student through this next school year? How can we get him to progress from this grade to the next grade? What are things that are barriers to him that we need to get around? Okay, so that's something that you can think about for education and training. It's not always visiting colleges or looking to see what types of institution or training he might want to go into. It could talk about just how are we progressing from this stage into the next stage. For employment, this could be related to getting into the right employment situation, like connecting with vocational rehabilitation, getting a part-time job, working in an auto shop, so on and so forth. But it can also just mean, how are we going to get the student ready for the world of work? Maybe you've got a student that really has never worked, and they don't really do a lot at home. They kind of sit on the sofa. They don't have a good work ethic. So maybe that's something you work on in the employment annual goal. How are we going to help the student develop a better work ethic? So you could outline things, maybe chores at home. Start getting him to do some things. Maybe volunteer situation. Maybe getting a part-time job or a job in the community. And sometimes it doesn't even have to do with work. The employment goal, maybe the student really will not be able to get to a job if they don't drive. So it could be getting the student to the point where he's got a driver's license. You know, whatever it is that's going to help the student be successful in the world of work. Maybe even looking at self-determination skills. This next category is community participation, and I want you to understand that there's overlap. You can address some things in employment that would also be appropriate in community participation. For instance, I just talked about driving and self-determination. Well, those 2 kinds of skills, of course, are going to be helpful when the student is participating in the community, being an active member of their community. Okay, but for the most part, we talk about community participation when we're talking about getting out into the community, utilizing some of those services, being able to shop, be a good consumer. Some other things to talk about is, as a student gets older, what are they doing to make sure that they're ready to vote? Are they registered for selective services? Are they considering how they're going to get from place to place? Do they know how to use a bank? What about leisure activities? That's certainly community related. So those things can be looked at as well. So this is optional depending on the student need, of course. If we look at adult living skills, these are things that the student's going to need to be able to live independently as an adult. Now, if you wrote a post-secondary goal for independent living, this would be a great place to add some annual goals. Okay, so adult living skills are things that are helping the student be able to live independently, such as money management, managing a household, being able to shop, those kinds of things. And again, you can see there could be some overlap between adult living skills and community participation. Just remember, you don't have to write annual goals for these 4 categories. Pick and choose the ones that you think are going to be most pertinent for that student's success as an adult. And don't be redundant. If you write something in one area, don't write it in another just because it fits, all right? Make sure that you're not recreating the wheel. Related services, that's basically taking a look at the services that the student's going to need outside of their regular support system, and this can be the continuation of some of the therapies, OT, PT, SLP, all of those things. It could be mobility training in a community setting if they have a vision impairment. What are the services the student's going to need after they leave you? Okay, so this is where you can talk about the continuation of what they're getting now, or it could be preparing them and their families for lining up services for after high school. Some examples for related services could be hooking a student up with a voc rehab counselor, getting on the VR caseload. Also, it could be something like attending a transition fair so that the parent and the student can learn what resources are available to them in their community. So this is very important to take a look at as well. And the last one listed here is daily living skills. Now, to me, these are the things that a student needs to be able to do to kind of self-manage or get through the day successfully. So this can be controlling their environment. It could be dressing, eating, bathroom skills. It could be sticking to a calendar, being able to follow a calendar, using an alarm clock to wake themselves up. It could be taking medication independently, whatever those skills are. Oftentimes we think about daily living skills when we think about the students who are lower functioning, but that's not necessarily always true. Think about students with autism, for instance. Even a college-bound student with autism or Asperger's may need some skills developed in daily living, making sure that they are where they're supposed to be when they're supposed to be there, dressing appropriately, things like that. Hygiene issues, the list goes on. Okay, so when we're writing annual goals, again, the key is be unique and meaningful with these goals. Always ask, what are some goals that will help this student get closer to being able to reach his or her post-secondary goals? And, this is very important too, are these attainable in a year? Please remember that, because oftentimes we will see a goal, let's say an 8th grader, and a goal was written for the student to start visiting colleges. Well, it's a little early for an 8th grader to start visiting colleges. And so this is something that you really need to take a close look at. Even though at the 8th grade level, people say, well, it's just difficult to come up with annual goals. We're not really sure what he's going to need from the 9th grade. Well, you can still take a look at what happens in the middle school level. What can they possibly do in or outside of school to help them get ready that much closer to be a good employee or a good post-secondary student. Make sure that you don't write goals that all students have. Okay, one that we see oftentimes, which we really don't like, is John will obtain all the credits necessary for a 9th grader so that he can move on to the 10th grade. Well, isn't that what all students want? Okay, there's nothing special about that goal. And so, since that's something all students want, that's really not a good goal. What you do ask yourself, however, is what is standing in the way of John getting to the next grade? Perhaps he's he's not very focused, okay, and he doesn't complete all of his assignments on time. So that could be something to focus on in the education and training area. So you just kind of have to look at it that way. Don't write goals that aren't attainable in a year, and don't write goals that don't align with that post-secondary goal. Make sure that everything is kind of a continuum to reaching that post-secondary goal. Again, I'm being a little repetitive, but I think it's important because it gets embedded in our mind that way. So if we break it down and we start with looking at annual goals for education and training, these are some examples, and I think these might be helpful to give you an idea of some things you might be able to write. For instance, investigating post-secondary options. These are some things that a student might do as they get a little older now. This isn't necessarily something an 8th or 9th grade student might do, but 11th and 12th graders perhaps, okay? So you can do that, but you can also, and this is probably more appropriate for most of your students, succeeding at school this year. Just what I was talking about a minute ago. So these are some sorts of things that you can focus on in the education and training area. All right, so let's take a look at Robert. Now I went ahead and came up with one for Robert for education and training. And one thing, if you'll notice on your transition planning checklist, it does have to be measurable. The annual goals do have to be measurable. If you write in a way that it's a SMART goal, that is actually a best practice, okay? But at the very least, it must somehow be measurable so that as we go through and we review these goals, we can check off. Was it done? Yes, no. To what degree has it been done? That sort of thing. So you can see here, I wrote one that says, Robert will read at least 2 library books or magazines per month for pleasure. Now, why did I write that goal? Well, first of all, yes, this is a decent goal for Robert, because if you think back, he doesn't really like to read, and it's not a strength of his. However, it's important that he reads, especially if he wants to go to college, which he does, and reading is something that he needs to continue to work on. So if we can get him to start reading for pleasure, then that's going to hopefully kick in and be meaningful for him and help him really progress in reading. Okay, is it measurable? At least 2 library books per month for pleasure? Yes. We can set up some kind of a checklist for that. We can sit down with Robert every month and ask him, did you read 2 magazines or books? That's the sort of thing you do. It doesn't always have to be formal. Okay, now thinking about the annual goals for employment, these same things apply. I'm going to just kind of skip on down. Ask yourself, is there anything that's related to working while in school or will prepare the student for employment that he needs to work on? All right, and I've already talked about this a little bit, investigating careers, like taking more assessments, and thinking of other ways to investigate careers. Job shadowing, doing reports or research on different careers might be good. Looking at videos that depict people in different situations, doing different jobs, going out on community-based vocational training sites where they see people doing different jobs. All kinds of things can be considered here. Succeeding at school this year, which we've talked about already. Soft skills or employability skills, and these are just, what are the things that make a good employee? Getting to places on time, being able to take directives from a boss, getting along with coworkers, being able to manage their paycheck and read their paycheck, those kinds of things. Creating and strengthening work ethic or stamina. Maybe you've got a student who, I don't like to use the word lazy, but maybe a student who doesn't like to work, or a student that can't tolerate working for more than a certain period of time. So helping them develop in these areas. And then we should never forget these pre-employment skills that are so important. I think these are overlooked a lot. Helping a student understand how to fill out the pre-employment forms, completing job applications, taking tests or quizzes that are required before getting a job, interviewing skills, creating a resume, those kinds of things. So those can be worked into annual employment goals. All right, so this is something I want you guys to do, and this is going to take some time. So for this activity, it's probably going to take about, I'd say, 15 to 20 minutes for this activity, because I want you guys to do a good job. Now remember, I wrote a goal, measurable annual goal for Robert for employment and education and training. I want you guys to write one for employment, community participation, and adult living. And please utilize the tools you've got there. I think that transition planning checklist is going to be most helpful for you. And these can be just written on some of that blank paper that's on your table. It doesn't have to be on a transition plan format right now. So give yourself about 15 or 20 minutes on this. Okay, so let's take some time to share out, and in your own settings, at your own school districts, this would probably be a good time to put up some paper on the walls where people can go up and just write down their ideas and give some good discussion to whether or not these are good examples and how you might make them more measurable. I think that the activity afterwards is going to be just as important as the time at the table. So just put some time into that, please. So now it's time to work towards step 4. Take a look at step 4. And this is where we move just past the annual goals and we talk about what activities and services are going to be needed for this student to help them accomplish this annual goal. And so the rule that we're going to follow, and again on your transition planning checklist, you must have at least one activity or service for each goal that you've written. You can include as many people as responsible that's needed to carry out this activity or service. And as you can see here, it can be anybody. It doesn't have to be the student even. It can be the people that work with the student. It could be outside agencies. You can even involve the employer if he's at the meeting, whatever it takes. Now, one thing that I tell people is a lot of people get confused. A goal usually starts with Robert will, but activities and services are things that you do. These are things that different people will do to help Robert complete that goal. So to me, it's best if you don't say Robert will, don't state these as goals. Instead, start with an action verb to make sure that it's action-oriented. And remember, it's not always the student doing these anyway. And I'm going to just throw this in while we're on this topic. Date of completion is one of those columns on your transition plan. It's not something we check for compliance, but it is very useful and helpful for you at the district level because this is where you indicate whether or not this goal was met whenever you do the review. Okay, so I came up with some activities and services for Robert's education and training goal. And remember, his education training goal had to do with reading books for pleasure. Remember, at least 2 magazines or books per month. And I came up with 3 activities and services that might be helpful. Assist Robert in selecting library books that are high interest, low vocabulary. And who could be the people helping him with this? Could be the case manager, the parents, media specialist, parapro. It could be all sorts of folks, right? In different settings, too. Provide Robert the option to listen to books as he reads them. Maybe this is something, he has no attention span. And helping him to stay on target and stay focused is good whenever he listens to it as well. And create a way for Robert to record the names of the books he reads to give a verbal synopsis. So maybe at the end of each month you sit down with Robert and you say, okay, do you have it written down, what you read? Tell me about this book. What did you think about this? So there's some feedback. It's not just that he's slapping something on paper, that there's some accountability there. All right, so these are some examples of how you might write activities and services. Okay, so you guys created goals for employment and community participation and adult services. I want you now to create activities and services to go with those annual goals that you created just a few minutes ago. And again, this is going to take some time, so I'm going to let you work on this for about 15 or 20 minutes as well. Okay, so now that you've put some work into that, how was that, by the way? Was it hard? Was it fun? I think it's always interesting whenever you do this as a group because people do think outside the box, and it's really kind of fun to really create some things and do some brainstorming for this kind of thing. So go ahead and in your school district, as you're doing this presentation, this training, spend some time reviewing these and talking about them and talking about ways that they can be improved upon and how they can be used for different students, etc. So step 5 is the last one mentioned here, but it's certainly not the last one you should consider. This really should be considered before you even have the meeting. Inviting the key people to the IEP meeting. And if you have the transition documentation checklist in front of you, that one that's predominantly white that has the 10 columns in it, we look at this on items 8, 9, and 10 on that documentation checklist. All right? Let's take a look at this. So step 5 basically asks, have the key people been invited? And you can see on this visual, we've got different people. We've got the students, the regular ed teacher, the special ed teacher, the parents, evaluation experts, child experts, transition agencies, that's a big one, and school representatives. And of course, it can involve more than this. Like I said before, it can involve an employer. It can involve people from the the working world. It can involve college reps. You know, the list goes on. I've even seen other support people like clergymen come to this meeting. This says that you need to make sure that there is evidence that the student was invited to the meeting by the notification of the IEP meeting, which is also an invitation to the meeting, the signature page, or the minutes. Now, this goes to show you that this is not necessarily contained in the transition plan. This is an extra document that you need to look at to make sure that the student was at least invited to the meeting. So just make sure that somewhere in some of your documentation that it's made very clear that the student was invited to the meeting, and better yet, that the student came to the meeting. Okay, number 9 on that checklist says if an agency rep was invited, you must have evidence of it on the notification of the IEP meeting, invitation, the signature page, or the minutes. And so just make sure it doesn't have to be for every student. Not every student needs an agency rep at their meeting, but make sure that you've considered it. And especially for your older students, it's very, very important that at some point in time they have been at least considered for vocational rehabilitation consulting or some other outside agency. And when you do that, you're making connections between the agency reps and the families and the student. Okay, so this is just a listing, a partial listing of who can be that agency rep. As you can see, even the Department of Juvenile Justice could be somebody to consider. And if you're not familiar with all of these, I would just say, rather than me going into a lot of detail today, take some time to explore these. And you and your individual communities probably have many, many more that you utilize on a regular basis. And then number 10 on that documentation checklist says that the parent must have been given consent, must give consent if an agency rep was invited. So you show this by just showing that the agency rep was invited and that the parent somehow signed that page, or there's a check box that was checked that says, I understand this agency rep may be here. However your district does that is fine. Okay, and I think you see that. And then again, we've talked about this briefly before, and I'll just restate it, that talking about transfer of rights, this is completed at least 1 year prior to the student's 18th birthday. Actually, that's probably a misnomer. It should be completed prior to the student turning 18, not necessarily at least a year. And then again, when the student is 18. And again, talk about guardianship options very lightly, but really and truly be prepared to share information with parents as to where to go to find more information about guardianship options. All right, so I've included just a screenshot of an example of Robert's meeting documentation. I don't know if you can see this or not, hopefully so. But you can see here, let's take a look and see if Robert himself was invited. Let's see, here's the attendees. Okay, so it doesn't really come right out and say that the student was invited. The rule is here that the student has to be invited, but it doesn't really say, come right out and say that Robert was invited. And so if I were looking at this for compliance purposes, I would say, you know, I can't see that Robert was invited, so we might have to give a no on that one. So just make sure on yours that he is on there. Number 9, again, was an agency rep invited? Well, there is no agency rep listed here. It's just the case manager and the parent, which that's an issue in and of itself, which we're not going to get into all that today. But there's no agency rep invited, so that just tells me that maybe it's not time yet. Maybe the team didn't feel it was necessary for an agency rep to be there. And then the third thing says, if an agency rep was invited, did the parent give consent? Well, we would give an NA for that one because agency rep wasn't invited anyway, so the parent didn't have to give consent. All right, so hopefully that's clear to you. And that pretty much concludes the 5 steps. Hopefully you guys have this in your brain now. We always start with, where's the student now? Where's the student going? What can we do to help the student progress this next year? What are some activities and services that we can come up with to support the student as they reach that goal? And then the 5th one is, are the key people invited to the meeting. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is going to sort of nicely wrap this up, is creating a peer review process. Okay, you guys have access to a handout that was created by Jo Alice Ray and myself about a peer review process for transition planning purposes. And I'm not going to go into depth on that handout. You can read for yourself. It's very kind of concisely written, but it really goes into a little detail of how to do this. But in general, it's very important that you guys at a district level create some kind of a process so that you're making sure that all of your teachers are writing transition plans that are both compliant and are meaningful for each and every student, that they are going through some of these best practices that we've talked about earlier in this presentation. So step one is train your personnel. Make sure that you tell them how you're going to go about doing this, okay? That you've trained them on how to write compliant best practices are incorporated into transition plans, and that you teach your personnel how we're going to go about this peer review process, okay? Step two, work to achieve inter-rater reliability. And what that means is make sure that your teachers can write transition plans that are repeatedly compliant, that it's just not a hit or miss sort of thing, that they understand how to write transition plans well, and they can do it well repeatedly, but also that when you're looking at each other's plans, that you all come up with the same feedback, okay? And you can do this a number of ways, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail on this today because I want you guys to take some time on your own to go over some of your own transition plans and look at those plans and figure out if it's being written compliantly or not. And you can use the tools I've given you, the transition planning checklist, the transition documentation checklist, and also the transition feedback form, which we're going to take a look at in just a second. Okay, make sure that your teachers can rate each other's plans, find errors, find ways to make them better. Step three, decide how to implement this peer review process and how you're going to do it at your district. Now, this takes different forms depending on the size of your district, how many people you have in your district. I know that sometimes districts are small and the special ed director might check all the plans themselves. In other districts, maybe you've got one person at each school that will spot check plans, and they don't all have to be checked. But there needs to be a way to at least spot check to make sure that teachers are on the right track and they understand what the process is. So what I've come up with here is a sample transition plan feedback form. And you can see here I've got a student named Adam, and case manager was Mrs. Wonderful. And here I have an X here by not approved. This one was a poorly written transition plan. But I just want to give you an idea of how you might use this feedback form. And basically, you look at each of these sections and give them feedback. And here you can see I just did a little narrative. It says you didn't have any assessments listed, so I listed some typical ones. Please adjust as needed. I deleted one sentence. I said what he will do in high school, community-based instruction. Remember, here you're only to put what he's currently doing. CBI can be mentioned in the annual transition goals section. You know, this, again, depends on what you do in your district and what you guys decide you want to see in your transition plans. I will say that this is based on a draft copy of a transition plan. Okay, when I worked in a school district, when I developed this plan, I was asking teachers to submit a draft version of the transition plan to me a week before the IEP transition plan meeting to make sure that it was looking pretty good going into the meeting. Now, just keep in mind that when you do a draft transition plan and bring it to the meeting, partially written, that you make that clear to everybody at the meeting, that this plan is not complete by any means, but this is, I sat down with a student ahead of time, and we came up with a draft plan, and this can be edited and modified as we need to during this meeting. Make sure you do that. But doing a draft plan ensures that you're on the right track, that you've taken some time with it, and you've included lots of different things sometimes when you get at that meeting, you get in such a hurry to be done that you overlook things, that you don't include a lot of the information from the assessments, that you don't include a lot of the information from the student, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Moving on down this, for education and training, I said I added after graduation to the beginning. I deleted or technical, and I added with a job coach. So just, fixing some of the verbiage might be some of the things you give feedback on. And then, of course, depending on your district, some districts don't like the words pursue. And remember on Roberts it says wants to. It's better said if you use the words will or will acquire or, those kinds of stronger verbs. Okay? So that's just kind of a snapshot of what this could look like. And this would be the next page. I'm not going to go through all of this. You guys can take a look at some of the feedback that I provided for this one. Okay, and I will tell you that this was a real student back in whenever I was in a school district. I did change a good bit of it, though. Okay, so now it's practice time. We've looked at Robert as an example. We've looked at all the different pieces that we're going to be putting together now. So what I'd like to do is we're going to do sample 1 together as a large group. And then you're going to have an opportunity to work through samples 2, 3, and 4 in smaller groups. So let's go ahead and take a look at sample 1 together. You will need to be looking at those 3 tools that I've given you, the transition planning checklist, the transition documentation checklist, and the feedback form. And we'll do this together. And this will take probably a good 15 minutes or so. Okay, good. That was a great activity, and we did see that particular plan had a few little issues, and they're not always going to be good transition plans. And that's, again, why I caution you, these samples that you have access to are not samples that you should always follow when you're writing transition plans. These are good and bad samples, so just be cautious. All right? Now that we've all taken a look at sample 1, hopefully you guys now understand this process. We've got samples 2, 3, and 4, and everybody should have copies of those samples as well. Here I want you to work in pairs, or if you prefer, if you've got just a few people at your table, you can work as an entire table. But you can work together on looking at plans 2, 3, and 4. And what I want you to do is use the transition planning checklist as well as the documentation list checklist like we just did with sample 1, and decide if the plan was compliant, but also what can be done better. What are some things that maybe the teacher left out that would be better if they included or if they did a little differently. So let's spend some time on 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so now that you've done that, in a situation in your school district, you would review those and kind of see what everybody came up with. There is a key to those, so that's also going to be something that districts are going to have access to, so you can check the transition plans to make sure everybody put the yeses and the nos in the right places and they gave the right answers for those. So be looking for that key, make sure that you have it so that you can make sure that those were done correctly. And then the last thing that you would do at this presentation, at this training, is to give some time for the participants to look at their own transition plans and, again, utilize those tools, the transition planning checklist and the documentation checklist and the feedback form, if you'd like, to give some feedback on those. This part of the training could last anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, just depending on how many plans you would like your folks to go through. Any questions? If you have any questions, please direct those to myself or when allow at the State Department level. We would be happy to answer any questions for you. Backing up a little bit, make sure that you can accomplish these learning targets, that you're able to identify at least 5 best practices in transition planning. You can name the 5 steps to writing the transition plan. You can determine whether or not a transition plan contains the critical elements or all the 10 components to IDEA. and that I am able to suggest ways to improve upon previously written transition plans. All right? So hopefully, you guys can do all of those things according to learning targets. Again, if you have any questions, be sure that you contact myself or Wynne Lau at the Georgia Department of Education. We'll be happy to answer any questions for you. And I hope this has been helpful for you, and that you will utilize these tools, and that you will start seeing some great results in transition planning and programming with your students. Thank you very much.